Hello and welcome everyone to this monthly WFO webinar. My name is Ilya Karnaukhov and I'm the Senior Development Manager at the World Forum Offshore Wind. Today's WFO webinar is about current and future challenges of floating offshore wind. It's my great pleasure to welcome Bruno Geschier, Chairman Floating Offshore Wind Committee at WFO and our moderator for today's session, as well as three excellent speakers. Beth, the Development Director for Asia and Northland Power, Philippe Besson, Business Unit Manager at DEME Offshore, and Ralf Torr, the Program Manager Floating Wind at Catapult. And before we give the floor to Bruno, let me tell you a few things about WFO. The organization was founded a bit over 3 years ago, and we're a non-profit entity focused exclusively on offshore wind energy and its promotion. We have an international setup offices in Hamburg, Tokyo, Taipei, and New York. In terms of our activities, it's very straightforward as we focus on three things. We lobby for offshore wind around the world, we inform about offshore wind via various media channels, and we connect the global offshore wind community by doing events. And in terms of members, we're very happy to have over 75 global members from all segments of the offshore wind value chain, representing North America, Europe, Asia, and even Australia. And if you're not a member of WFO yet, please make sure to join us and check out our WFO website, and also contact Bruno Herzig, our Managing Director. If you have any question regarding the membership, please do not hesitate to reach us. And a few things about the structure of the webinar, which is actually very simple. During the first part of the event, Beth, Philippe, and Ralf will present on the topic, and during the second part of the webinar, they will answer to your questions. Each of the attendees can ask a question using the chat function on your control panel on the right-hand side. So without any further ado, Bruno, the floor is yours.
I'm extremely happy to be here today and with a quite exciting panel, especially at a time when we're still all waking up from the ScotWind dream, where over a single night on January 17th, we went from nothing to 15 gigawatts of floating wind to be implemented, to be built, and to be operational by the early 2030s. This comes as a very, very great excitement and very good news for the industry. So with all this excitement, we remain to be careful. We need to be careful, and hence the need also to be working with seasoned and experienced organization. We have today a panel with Beth, Wattleworth, Northland Power, a major developer, an asset owner, DEME. We don't have much to say about DEME. They are very well known. And then we cannot ignore the tremendous work that is achieved by Catapult to ensure that the industry is progressing on with the right solid understanding in terms of technologies, possibilities, potential, and also innovations. So I will leave the floor to Beth to start this, and we'll try to limit the presentations to 12-15 minutes so that we have plenty of time to interact with our audience today. So Beth, good luck, and thanks for contributing to this event.
Thank you, Bruno. Hopefully everything is working and you can hopefully see my slides on the screen. But firstly, let me start by thanking the WFO, so Bruno and Ilya, and gonna thank you for putting together and inviting us to speak today. And thank you to Philippe and Ralf for participating, because I'm quite looking forward to the discussion. So for anyone who knows me, I talk a lot, especially when it comes on floating and offshore wind. So I will try to keep the time, but yes, I'm sure Bruno will let me know if I start going too far. So yeah, very nice to speak today. So yeah, my name's Beth. I'm responsible for the Asia Pacific part of Northland Power, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our company, but then I'm going to jump straight into what we see as the challenges in floating. So there we go. So for those who might not know, Northland Power, we're a Canadian renewable and clean energy IPP. We're about 34 years old. We are in 12 different countries with over 1,000 employees. We've got a lot of operational projects in offshore wind and onshore renewables, with a lot of that being in Europe. We're the fourth largest operator of offshore wind as it is right now. And then I would say we're in the top 5 of the developers globally with the pipeline that we have to deliver in offshore wind. So I think it's a very exciting space that we're all in. So I should also say that only last week Northland had its annual Investor Day. So for those who might not be aware, we're a listed company. Really recommend, if you'd like to learn a lot more about Northland, you can hear our key, our CEO, our CFO, and our development head speaking a little bit more about our business. But I thought I'd just tell you a couple of things before I jump into the floating and offshore wind part of the presentation. As I mentioned, we're a global company. We develop, own, and operate. So it's really important I stress the operating part of our fleet. As you can see, we're across the globe there, from developing projects all the way over in Japan, which is where I would usually be based, all the way across into Europe and over into Canada, US, and Latin America. So as I mentioned, around 12 offices we have globally. Some of the most recent additions include a platform for onshore renewables there in Spain, and of course the success that was announced in Scotland, which I will talk a little bit more about later. So want to tell a little bit about the presence we have in Europe. So we have 3 operational projects currently in Europe, which is 1.2 gigawatts. And then we have a pipeline of projects. Last year was announced our Nord Sea 2 and 3 cluster alongside our partners of RWE. We have our Baltic Power project, which was also announced last year with partners of PKN Orlen. You're probably getting a theme here. We do have a lot of partners, and I think that's really critical to what we do and what the industry does. No matter where we are globally, I think partners are so critical. And then finally, the addition of our ScotWind sites, again, in sort of local level partnerships back in Scotland that was announced back in January. And I think, again, just to bring a theme out, I think it's really important to be part of industry bodies that are, pushing forward our sector in important messaging. So we try to be a member and an active member as many of these bodies as possible. So I do have the pleasure of spending time with Ralf and Catapult as we discuss floating. Into Asia, hopefully the slide is changing in a second. So in Asia, we have around 5 gigawatts as well in development, which is in offshore wind. That's spread between Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. Most of our main project is based in Taiwan, so people might be aware of Hai Long, which is a 1 gigawatt contracted fixed foundation site. But I wanted to make the note about Asia that I think is most exciting is a lot of these countries have huge, huge targets in offshore wind, and a lot of that is going to be delivered by floating offshore wind. And so, although the first projects coming through in our portfolio are definitely fixed foundation projects in these countries, the next round of projects and future projects to meet those attractive and huge goals of each of these countries will be floating offshore wind. So I think it's a very important enabler for the Asian market. So I kind of into the main part of this discussion and the sort of viewpoint that I'm coming at it, which is from a developer. I think what's really important to enable offshore wind, and as a result floating offshore wind, is it's got to be done with the right market requirements. So we could have all the technologies we want for floating, and we could have some of the great ideas, some of the technological advances, but we need the market structure to be there to be able to deliver this. And what do I mean by that is key factors such as that market that we're developing needs to have a demand for electricity. It might be a growing demand, or it might actually be a decarbonization of their current energy mix, which would then mean a demand for energy that needs to be delivered from clean, renewable sources. The markets need to have clear renewable and carbon targets, again, that can help drive that country, that market into offshore wind. it needs to have the technical viability. So it needs to have the wind or the water depth or the conditions, or at least have grid and key infrastructure to be able to deliver offshore wind projects. And it also needs to have a route to market, whether that is a corporate PPA, as we're starting to see some of the world move to. It could be the likes of the CFD mechanisms, or it could be like some markets like we see in Japan, where there are feed-in tariffs that are currently available. But we need some kind of route to market. So overall, in order to enable us to look at floating offshore wind, I think it's really critical that we focus on making sure that the market is a market as a structure is ready for offshore wind and for floating. And that brings me to the little enablers in the middle that I think are really important that we discuss in this forum. And I will leave my esteemed colleagues to talk a bit more around some of the technical details of floating that needs to be unlocked. Whereas I'm looking at the fact that I think floating is really an enabler for growth. It's an enabler for countries to actually meet their carbon targets, but we need to have these requirements in place to be able to develop. So just digging into these topics a little bit more, what do I mean exactly? Policy and a regulatory framework. The clarity and transparency from a government, whether that is a marine spatial plan. So maybe Scotland is a perfect example there, where the marine spatial planning was done. It's done as well in consultation with developers to help identify and stakeholders, fisheries, water users, environmental bodies, to decide where all the best places are for offshore wind. That clarity helps developers in the industry get some ability to plan and understand that there's a clear route to delivering projects. It also just needs to have the permitting processes, whether it's environmental processes and all those mechanisms of the right government bodies. We see some markets now starting to adopt single windows for developers to come in, to be able to get that information from the government, to be able to allow them to progress quicker. We need to make sure that these bodies, these markets are creating a landscape that is really conducive to working with developers and the supply chain. So all those signals around the policy, I think, is absolutely critical for this sustainable growth in floating. The second one that I also think as a developer that I should be learning from around the world and transferring it to new markets, especially because there's quite a lot of markets that are going to come that are only going to be floating, and they're going to need electricity, and they're going to have really the potential in floating, is the stakeholder and local partnerships. We all know that there are a lot of water users in many of these countries and locations that floating may pose some challenges for use of the water, but also we need to be able to give them as much information as possible and get rid of some of their concerns early in any development process. And I think that is also critical as an industry, that we work together to be able to give very clear and consistent messages. A developer going in with one idea and a developer going in with another idea, different floating. There could be a lot of confusion if we're mixed messaging. So I think it's really important that stakeholders, we're all aligned as an industry of how we communicate and how we engage. Local partnerships, I think, is such a broad category to enable floating and enable offshore wind as an enabler for growth. But I mean that a lot of the markets around the world have local developers, have a local industry that we need to work with and engage with, whether that's for job creation or the fact that they really just know how to develop. I know from hands-on experience out in Asia through some of our partners, who are able to really navigate the local landscape. And I think as an international player with experience in offshore, that partnership locally really helps us enable the chance, give us a greater chance of success to deliver a project. I think thirdly, industry associations, hugely important. We're going to talk a little bit more, I'm sure, when Ralf speaks shortly, but I think, they are sometimes a bit of the glue. So hopefully bringing that experience in from private bodies, or bringing experience in from other sectors or from other countries, and sharing that along our network. I always sort of reflect on, oil and gas being quite transparent on certain things. And I think, again, for floating in our sector, that transparency, that openness to work together, whether it's learning from something Scotland did really well, or the French tenders did well, or maybe something in Japan, how do we actually bring all that together and do it as a complete front, a concise message, I think, is really important. And I think these ones actually then lend themselves to some of the other parts of what we need to deliver floating offshore wind and these challenges. So building a cost-competitive supply chain. And I will let Philippe talk a little bit more there around that with DEME. But of course, it's not just the capital cost of building the project, all the OPEX, all the infrastructure. A lot of that is related back to policy and the clarity of goals that a country could give, or a framework that the country could give that will help us, bring that supply chain into the market and allow it to grow. And then finally, I guess some of the challenges that our esteemed colleagues who are working in the designers of these solutions, things like extreme weather conditions and that sort of safety and working around the world. Every market is so different, every location is so different. So how to standardize a little bit about what we do, but also really meet some of the challenges around extreme weather. There's a lot of markets around the world that are, to get those wind speeds and get those locations, will also be encountering some of these challenges. So fundamentally, I think it's all about sharing the lessons in these kind of key areas, but I really want to draw people's attention to there being a market and having a demand for electricity in a market, having the right carbon targets, having the whole structure to deliver a project. That clarity to the market is so important for growth. So just to sort of wrap it up, again, I could speak all day. Maybe just bringing out our little case study into ScotWind and tying in some of those key things that actually we have just seen through the ScotWind process. So firstly, I'm very proud to announce that we, of course, were quite successful in the leases awarded some of N2 and N4. So that includes 1.5 gigawatts of floating there in the N2 zone. So as Northland, we're very much committed into delivering these projects. We see floating as an enabler to allow us to make these projects a success. And success for us is everything from the successful partnerships on the ground, these partnerships with government, but fundamentally delivering an operational project is the big measure of success. What I really liked about this process was, and I think Bruno alluded to it a little before, it was one large auction. So it really gave a lot of certainty to the supply chain and to investors and developers that the sector was going to happen and the industry was going to happen. There are a lot of smaller auctions happening around the world that maybe go through annual processes, and it's quite hard to predict. It's quite hard for the supply chain to react and really mobilize, whereas ScotWind has kind of put it all there on the table. It had that early engagement between government and industry in order to identify the best sites. And it viewed the market as like one market. So although we're talking today about floating, it basically decided all these sites are good for offshore wind. And then as a developer, it was our decision to come up with solutions where floating is a key solution to deliver these projects. So it really, by putting it all in one large auction, it really allowed us to come up with the solutions. And we really did focus a lot on the local partnerships. And I think that came through in the actual criteria. So not just price, but actually looking at business plans, local supply chains, local partnerships. They were valued. And therefore, I believe Scotland will get an awful lot more for this than just price. So that's the end. I'm sorry, I probably went a little bit over time. But just to recap, we are very much committed to wind and to floating. We're really excited about where the sector is going. Really like to make sure that as a developer, we're acting in the industry's best interest, really focusing on those markets and the regulatory side of it, and working with all our industry associations and partners like the WFO to deliver it. So feel free to reach out for a virtual tea or coffee anytime. Happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Beth. And we can suggest Philippe to join if he's ready, unless Ilya, you have someone else in mind. No, there is Philippe. Bonjour, Philippe. Hello, Philippe. And the floor is yours.
You have the presentation on the screen, yeah?
Yes, all good, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So thanks everybody to attend this presentation. So I think most of you know DEME for a long time. DEME is a major company involved in for more than one century in offshore activities. So history of DEME was based around dredging activities, but we have also developed some specialties in environmental or infrastructure facilities. But today we are talking about DEME Offshore, and DEME Offshore is organized around two entities. One is renewables and the second one is non-renewable. So about renewables, we are involved as T&I and EPCI contractor, installing some foundation mainly for the time being for bottom fixed wind farms. And we have also expertise and great capacity in cable lay activities, installation of turbines, and operation and maintenance. We are based in most of these countries. You can see on the map. We have a registered company in Asia, in America, and in Northern Europe. So it's giving us the possibility to be considered in most of these places as a local player. In terms of track record, DEME Offshore is involved for 20 years in installation of wind farms, so bottom fixed wind farms. We have more than 2,700 turbines installed during these last 20 years. More than 3,000 kilometers of cable laid in these facilities. And so today we can consider that DEME is for sure a key player, and it's the reason why we would like to be also a leading company and a pioneer in this world of floating offshore activities. In order to perform these works, we have developed for 20 years these specific vessels, and the approach and the strategy of DEME is to own and operate its own vessels. The DNA of DEME during these last 20 years was to develop its own equipment. We like to own our vessel, but we like also to develop and to adapt this vessel and the equipment, the tools we need in order to perform and to be successful. It's a case with this, for example, this specific drilling tool, vertical drilling tool we have developed for the Saint-Nazaire project. And today is giving us the possibility to be successful in terms of schedule. We have installed 55 foundation. We have still about 30 foundation to be installed. But we are roughly 1 month ahead of schedule. So this is a great success. And we want to transfer this approach to the floating wind market. In terms of development, also we are always thinking about the next vessel having the capacity, the right capacity, and the right equipment in order to be able to perform and to be successful. For example, with this DP3 vessel, we have also developed some simulator in order to prepare, to think about the solutions, to analyze the risk, and to train our operator, and by the way, to save time during operation. And these equipments are based in Antwerp. We are always upgrading our own equipment in order to perform post-trenching or burial of cable, for example. And so this transfer of expertise from bottom fix to floating will be based on our past experience in installation of foundation, in cable lay activities, and in wind turbine installation and possibly in maintenance. In terms of floating, we have to face several challenges. The first challenge is to have the capacity to be involved in all these projects using different types of foundations. So for us as DEME, we are not involved in directly involved in fabrication of the floaters, but we may be partners in this field of activity. But the key point today for us is to propose the best solution in terms of installation. So this is the first challenge. The design may be provided by the client, or the client may ask us to propose a solution with a specific design. The other key point of this floating activity will be to take into account the mass production of the floaters. So as DEME, we have experience in large production of foundations, but taking into account the fact that we will have 50, 80, 100 floaters to be fabricated. It's another challenge in terms of facilities, in terms of a harbor, in terms of yards, and all these aspects are taken into account today in our development of alternative solution, because it will be a key issue during the next coming years and decades. So starting from transfer, load out, transportation, we think that we may offer some alternative solution, like using our heavy lift vessels. In terms of turbines also, I will say that today the conventional way is to think about onshore cranes, heavy cranes. We think that it may be some alternative solution based on some new tools to be developed, and that's a key part of the activity of our engineering department for the time being. Also, due to the great numbers of floaters and turbines to be installed, the wet storage of these facilities will be also certainly a key point to solve when we are looking at the huge number of floaters to be installed in the next coming years, for example, in Scotland. Considering also our experience in terms of mooring, so we take into account the different type of design, for example, honeycomb solution, and we think that due to the expertise we have in suction pile or driven pile, we have to find the solution to install a huge number of anchors in a very short time. Is the reason why also we are developing some new drilling tools in order to be able to install drill piles in water depth below 100 meter. It may be 200, 300 meter water depth. So we have to reconsider the way to approach this part of the scope of work if we want to be able to deliver successfully large wind farms, as it will be the case within next coming years. In terms of cable, we are also thinking about different solution, having possibility to prelay the cable or to have a direct hang-off of a cable during the cable activities. So all these method statements are under preparation by our teams in order to be ready and to offer the most efficient solution at the cost, also cost-effective solution within next coming projects. And so we are also involved in offshore substation installation. So for the time being, conventional systems are based on bottom fixed jacket foundation, but we have to think about floating offshore substation, and in the future subsea substation, which will require heavy lifting vessels. And final, in terms of operation and maintenance, the request for the time being is to think about tow to port, but we think that in the future this solution may be not the good solution. So we think that we have to develop some equipment having the capacity to be operated from offshore. So this is a way we are thinking by DEME. We are also looking for developing some floating-to-floating solution. We think it may solve some of these issues, and we think it's a good way to face these new challenges. And so, in order to be able to think about it and to prepare this future, we have developed some DP3 vessel with heavy cranes. But we understand that there are some limits in terms of height, and if we are thinking about the increasing size of the wind turbines, we need to find some alternative solution, because we cannot increase the height of the crane, and we have to limit this size in order to be efficient and cost effective. So in terms of news, DEME has been awarded of many projects recently in US, for example, where we have to install foundation, turbines, and cables. And we have been successful also in the Scotland project, ScotWind project, sorry. And we have 2 gigawatts of wind farms, 1 gigawatt based on bottom fixed and 1 gigawatt based on the floating solution. So this is briefly how we feel the challenges we have to face within next coming years. And we have started some years ago thinking about this new world, and so we will be ready very soon to give some more details regarding our alternative solution for installation of floating wind turbines.
And now let's welcome Ralf, who will share with us a little more about all the efforts our Catapult is doing to again keep on promoting the key issues of and to keep on contributing to this cost reduction, reliability, you name it, of floating wind. Efforts you guys have been starting for quite some time, and we're quite visionary in that aspect. So thank you very much, Ralf, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And thanks to Bruno and panel colleagues as well for joining. So yeah, hopefully you can all see my slides. I'll briefly introduce the program that I look after, the Centre of Excellence, but then the bulk of the slides that I've got will look at the kind of particular challenges as we understand them at the moment. Yeah, hopefully just get wrapped up in about 10 minutes or so we can have a bit of a discussion amongst the panel afterwards and take some questions. So yeah, firstly, welcome. My name is Ralf Torr. I'm a program manager at the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, and I run our Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence program. So it's established just over 2 years ago now. We've currently got 15 industry partners, some of the world's leading floating offshore wind project developers. And we work with them to develop and deliver quite a broad program of activity, all aimed at accelerating the commercialization of floating offshore wind. As well as our industry partners, more recently, we've established a relationship with an academic program based in the UK. And also the UK government has just this year agreed to provide some direct funding into the program as well to help support our efforts and I guess themselves learn a bit more about how they need to support the growth of the sector. 2 main reasons why we're looking to support the commercialization of floating offshore wind. For the UK in particular, it's going to play a key role in delivering a cost-effective net zero in the same way as it will in other markets. But also, I think in all of these same markets, there's a credible opportunity for it to be a real driver of economic activity. And so our work program is very much focused on commercializing floating offshore wind in terms of reducing risk and reducing cost, but also being mindful that there is a desire and an expectation that it creates economic opportunities in markets as well. It's quite a broad program, 4 different work streams. We'll work on technology, supply chain infrastructure and operations, development consenting, and one which we call delivering net zero, which is really about the kind of enabling policy that's required to support the sector, and Beth touched on a couple of the key points in her presentation. It's a very flexible program, so whilst we do quite a lot of the work at the moment funded ourselves directly, we have a number of kind of collaborative relationships established where we're co-funding, co-delivering work, and over the next couple of years the level and size of that collaborative activity is going to grow significantly. So it's really important to us that we can kind of collaborate and augment activities in the sector. We've got a website there, so please feel free to make your way to that and learn a bit more about the program. So yeah, with respect to the kind of current challenges, I've just captured a couple here, and then there's a couple of other kind of future challenges as well. So I think we're all aware where floating offshore wind is at the moment with respect to cost. The Centre of Excellence programme, one of the first projects we did, looked at the potential for floating offshore wind to kind of reducing cost over time, to try and understand, you know, ultimately where it could get to and what the kind of key drivers were. And certainly our view is that floating offshore wind has the potential to achieve what we refer to as a kind of subsidy-free level, where effectively the projects are able to deliver electricity into kind of large-scale energy systems at a price point that's lower than the wholesale price of electricity. So we certainly think they can get there. It's the key drivers of cost reduction, you know, maybe relatively unsurprisingly in the short term, the scale of deployment, but also understanding the role that innovation has in the medium and longer term, learning rates, cost of capital, and various other factors as well. So you can see there on the screen, there's a report that we delivered about 18 months ago, which has got a fairly good overview of that. So for further reading there, I'd encourage you. I think in terms of the current challenges, I don't think the high price point at the moment is in itself a major challenge. I think we have the confidence of governments and markets. I think the challenge the industry had is to continue to build and maintain that confidence. So there's an understanding that it's more expensive in the short term, but we need to rapidly demonstrate that we as an industry can drive that cost down. I think we know how to do it, but I think it's really important that we maintain that confidence with government and in the different markets. The second point to flag with respect to challenges, I guess, is environmental interaction. There's been a lot of focus historically on the technical challenges in floating wind, which are very real and rightly have required a lot of focus. But I think now, as we're moving into the commercial and kind of leasing processes, the kind of the environmental interaction elements are really coming into sharp focus. And I think the industry needs to work collaboratively over the short term to really fully understand and bottom out this environmental interaction, and also understand how this needs to be accommodated in project design. Some of these environmental interactions are potentially quite significant, particularly on other marine users, and they do need to be considered when designing projects and selecting technology. And certainly for those organisations with leases, this is a very real challenge that they're facing at the moment. Second set of challenges, I guess overall, different technology components I think are perceived to have different levels of technical risk associated with them. There's not so much technology that we're looking to use which is completely novel, but I think where we're taking technology from other sectors and deploying it in floating offshore wind, it's really important that we are developing and qualifying that technology for its applications specifically within floating wind. And there's a couple of particular, what we refer to as critical components, that I think we really need to focus on as an industry. So dynamic cabling systems and mooring and anchoring systems, whilst they don't make up a large share of the CapEx, are really important parts of the integrity of the overall system. And so I think there's a real focus that we need to take on an industry and making sure that we can deploy those components cost effectively, but also really with very, very high levels of reliability. And I think part of that is making sure that we're learning as much as we possibly can from the early projects. I refer to it as a kind of an enhanced feedback loop, but making sure that we're getting them as much learning as we can from the early projects to feed back into that technology design, testing, and qualification process. And then the final challenge that I'll touch on in the short term is on infrastructure development. So floating offshore wind, you know, the technology is physically very large, and certainly in most markets, a level of port infrastructure development is going to be required. And that's really important because not only does it allow the projects to be delivered very cost effectively, or most cost effectively, but also those ports are an absolute hub for the project delivery process. And as such, when you're looking at making sure that the local markets are benefiting with respect to GVA, it's really important that those hub port infrastructure developments sit within those markets. The development, depending on the scale of it, it's not a short-term thing. It's often planning and environmental permitting required before you even get around to the construction. So we can't wait for the first projects to get to financial close before we start progressing this. And there's some good work going on in the UK and internationally on developing such infrastructure. We've looked at some of our project work quite hard at the kind of business and investment cases for those developments. And it's really, you know, one of the real kind of keys to unlocking investment, particularly private sector investment, is the visibility of the long-term project pipelines in regions, because that links very directly to the utilization of those facilities. So I think for markets where there isn't that long-term pipeline, you know, particularly private sector investment in those developments is going to be a real challenge. Yeah, the other thing is, you know, in none of the developments we've looked at is floating offshore wind. Even in Scotland, with such a large pipeline of projects, none of those developments really look like they're going to fly when we look exclusively at floating offshore wind as a business opportunity. So floating offshore wind technology and projects need to be looking to make sure that they can utilize, you know, large but versatile port facilities for their needs. We can't be focusing on having floating offshore wind specific port infrastructure. We need to work with kind of major port facilities which are also serving other sectors as well. And again, that's a key way of making sure those facilities can be developed and financed in an appropriate fashion. So looking out longer term now, a couple of, I guess I'd call them future challenges. I mean, we're wrestling with these at the moment, but in terms of when things are really going to come into focus, these are perhaps a step away. So I think, you know, touch on some of the points that have been flagged recently. I think that the big shift that we're going to go through over the next 5 or 10 years is the shift from creating substructures using a kind of bespoke fabrication model to a serial production model. And so that's viewing substructures as effectively assemblies created of substructure components, and those components are going to need to be produced using a serial production method. We just won't get the projects to that subsidy-free point if we are doing bespoke manufacturing for each and every substructure, even if we're talking about doing this in, you know, in kind of distant markets where labour is cheaper. So we need to shift to this kind of component and modular design process and do that fairly readily. And if we can do that, then we can achieve the same efficiencies and economies of scale that we have in fixed bottom foundation manufacture and even kind of turbine component manufacture as well. Second kind of future risk, I guess, is one that's really starting to play on people's mind now as well, and Bruno touched on this, you know, right at the outset, is the construction process that we're going to go through for these projects is a very complex process, and it's an area of elevated risk in all offshore wind projects. But I think the first couple of large floating offshore wind projects, there's going to be a real focus on the success of those construction activities. So I think a real focus on planning, simulating, and de-risking that process is going to be required to demonstrate to the broader industry, to government, but also to lenders and investors that we can deliver these projects cost effectively. And that can help drive costs down, not just through efficiencies, but allowing particularly project finance to enter the project at an earlier stage. So yeah, last 2 points to touch on with respect to future challenges. Operations and maintenance, I guess, was always going to be in here. You know, we do currently have a way to do almost all the activities that we need to with floating offshore wind, but it's clear that doing the kind of default situation we have at the moment is you know, really needs to be improved to be cost effective. And there are definitely conceptually technologies that can be developed that can really drive down the cost of both planned and unplanned operations and maintenance activities. And again, we can't wait until the first projects go in the water for these technologies to be developed. So we need to kind of artificially accelerate that development process so these first projects can start using those technologies from the outset. And I guess we are already, for the projects with leases, starting to make early design decisions, and some of them can have quite big impacts on the way that we do O&M and the opportunities that we have. A good example that we've looked at is the use of autonomous systems. So some of the design decisions we make about projects can help or hinder the implementation of autonomous systems for operations and maintenance. So yeah, key point here, I think, is that O&M needs to be considered from the very outset in all projects, but I think the first large floating offshore wind projects, I think that's really, really key. And then the final point, which is somewhat market specific, but I think a lot of floating wind projects are going into deeper water, further from shore, and there's huge potential there. So for anybody familiar with the current INTOG process in development in Scotland, huge areas of sea being talked about for development there, which is an absolutely fantastic industrial opportunity for floating wind and for Scotland particularly. But we are going to need quite a different approach to planning and deploying transmission and offtake technologies, and new commercial models are going to be required for that. And I think that's common across a number of markets. So that transmission and offtake, both technical and commercial elements, are a real kind of challenge, I think, that we're going to need to deal with over the next kind of 5 years or so. So yeah, before I hand back to Bruno, just a brief overview of the programme of work that we're delivering in the Centre of Excellence at the moment. If you head over to our website, you can learn a bit more about it. But yeah, quite a diverse range of project activity there, all aimed at really helping to identify, understand and address issues with our partners. So yeah, just to wrap up, I think this industry has a good understanding of the challenges, but we've got a lot of work to do to tackle them. We've got time to do it, and certainly the opportunities and the return on the investment as a result, you know, is worth it, and I think there's a huge opportunity there. But yeah, the main point I think to highlight is that the collaboration that we are already seeing in the industry is going to be the thing that absolutely makes or breaks the success of the industry. And I think striking the appropriate balance between kind of commercial and competitive interests with that desire and need to share collaboratively is going to be really key to success over the next 5 years. So yeah, with that, I'll hand back to Bruno.
Thank you very much, Ralf, and thank you, Philippe and Beth, for all those very valuable inputs. Quick question before perhaps we go to some questions that might come from the audience through Ilya, is as I mentioned earlier on, this is a tremendous opportunity for the industry, and I'm particularly talking about ScotWind, putting floating wind truly on the map. In the meantime, floating wind is still fragile. So how do we properly combine that excitement, that need to deliver those gigawatts, those 15 gigawatts by 2030, and the fact that we still need to be very careful, because as we've seen, any setback, that's valid for any brand new or young industry, any setback could actually take us back 5 or 10 years in terms of credibility, in terms of confidence from the financial institutions, insurance companies, etc. How do we do this? How do we balance this excitement with this need for prudence? And perhaps Ralf, go ahead.
Yeah, no, happy to start. No, I think you're absolutely spot on. And whilst, for example, Scotland's really kind of caught the headlines, and you know, there's a huge step forward for the industry, I think we've been very clear here in the UK, and I guess more broadly, that the industry, you know, we need to ramp up rather than step up in terms of the scale of the activity. And there's a lot of focus at the moment about how, in the UK particularly, we can bring forward a number of kind of intermediate scale projects which allow us to kind of learn and understand and demonstrate some of these processes in advance of the first major projects going in the water. And even for the first large projects from Scotland, for example, you know, there's an opportunity for them to take a phased approach. So, you know, there will be very significant commercial pressure on those projects, which I think will drive a desire to go large for commercial reasons. So I think we need to work kind of sensitively and collaboratively to make sure that the industry kind of scales up its activity between, say, 2025 and the early 2030s, rather than trying to go from just a handful of demonstrator projects to a handful of very large major projects. So
thank you.
I think it's going to be key.
Thank you, Ralf. With the understanding that even though collaboration is essential, as you see, and you're a perfect example of that, with collaboration come also limitations, since every developer technology provider has IP issues that need to be mitigated. But point well taken. Beth, if she's still on, and I'm sure she is, from a developer's point of view, how do you interpret this excitement? But first and foremost, how, as a developer, do you intend to mitigate all those risks of dealing with a brand new technology, and really just specifically for ScotWind, because that is one of the major huge scale projects you guys will have to deliver?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and kind of echo a lot of Ralph's thoughts on it there, Bruno. But I do think you touched on it in your kind of run into this question. Transparency and the sharing of knowledge. I know that you mentioned it's harder for developers to share knowledge, or it's hard for foundation designers to share knowledge. But in order for us not to have made such a big leap forward in ScotWind and then go all the way back 5 years, as you said earlier, I think there's got to be a lot of that lessons learned and that transparency between developers. Whether it's just parts of the development chain to start with, whether it's environmental risks or local stakeholder risks. But I think we have to find forums to be able to share that information, because we all want these projects to reach, the financial close and start to be being built. But there's lots of development risks that come along with floating that, I think we need to be very clear and transparent about, and have a consistent message. So find the right forums to be consistent and not have one set of developers saying one thing to another. So from my perspective, I think it's really around the right regulation and transparency and knowledge sharing and finding a way to do that. And I think that's really one of our jobs to find a way to do that, alongside Catapult, alongside WFO and others. How can we all be transparent? So I think that's what I would focus most on.
Thank you, Beth. One quick question for Philippe. Very difficult for you guys for a company such as DEME to anticipate to have the right equipment at the right time. On the subject of wind turbines getting bigger and bigger, and obviously being perfect for floating wind applications, what is your view on that in particular? How far will you go, and how big can your ships and vessels that you will build, how big will they get, to make sure that you're never too late in delivering or offering the right vessel to install the proper wind turbine?
Yeah, you're right. To be there at the right time, it's a key point, and we need to anticipate. But as I mentioned during the presentation, we think now that we are reaching some limits in terms of for example, in terms of cranes, because of the height of the towers we have on which we have to install, for example, turbines. So we have to think a different way and to prepare some alternative solution. And this is the way we are developing our new equipment in order to be able to go through this challenge, which is the height and the weights to be lifted. So we think we have to definitely to think another way, and not to pursue this race to the big vessels. We, at the end of the day, we will reach a limit. We need to be cost effective, and we cannot have a vessel which are more and more expensive every day. So we need to find some alternative solution, and it's today our key driver.
Thank you, Philippe. I will leave the final remarks to Ilya. And again, I want to thank you personally for your involvement in with this today's seminar, and I'm sure we'll soon see each other. I take this opportunity to make sure everyone joins us at FOWT, still the world's largest event fully dedicated to floating wind, that will take place in the south of France, in Montpellier, mid-May. for its, I don't know anymore which edition, if it's the 7th or the 8th or the 9th, but in any case, still the place to be if you want to learn more about floating wind and meet as many people from the entire value chain dealing with floating wind. So thank you very much. Ilya, the floor is yours, or the digital one at least.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you very much, Bruno, Beth, Philippe, and Ralf, for your presentations and for your views. Let's bring us to the end of this webinar, unfortunately. So please join us next month. The following webinar will be held on March 16th, the same time. And the topic of the webinar is offshore wind development challenges. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, audience, that you found time for this 1-hour webinar. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.